been waiting a bit for people to join. I can see people still joining. You're all most welcome to this series of dialogues we are organizing at COPPEAD with various partners to discuss key issues in business and management. I'm happy to be here to take care of the fifth one, where we will bring forward a very interesting concept called low-touch economy. We'll be talking about it throughout the whole seminar. So I would like to start by saying thank you to COPPEAD for the whole infrastructure, in particular Alexandre, who is here helping us, Carla, Hayes, and Ivania Morgado that have been putting this forward, organizing with faculty members so that everything runs smoothly. And again, a second big thank you to the Board of Innovation, and in particular Vicent Pirenne for being here with us, CEO for Americas at Board of Innovation, to discuss this interesting topic. Before I pass it over to Vicent, I would like to say a few words of how I came across the report. It was actually a friend of mine, an architect, he's called Alziro Neto, and he showed me that, and we started at first discussing implications for architecture and in-house reorganization of the spaces throughout the trends of home office and everything. But once I came across the report in more details and started digesting all the ideas there was a lot, and I do recommend that you go for their website to check it in more details afterwards. I was very impressed with the work they've done and how quick they managed to put together such interesting insights about how the economy will evolve once we have this challenge that we are facing, and trends that were already occurring that have been accelerated also because of the things that we are living through the pandemic and so forth. And I had to say that I said, well, I think exactly the way they are thinking, not as rich and in-depth as they did, but it resonates a lot with the way that I was looking at things while I was seeing people trying to pretend that nothing would change. And then I started going further into the report and bringing it forward to all my executive MBA and Master of Science classes that I teach. And then I had the chance to connect, and they were quite generous to be quite open to discuss the idea of setting up this webinar where we will discuss the low-touch economy concept and adaptations of this concept to the reality of Brazilian businesses and the Brazilian reality in particular, right? So having said that, I will pass it over to Vicent. Then I will be talking a bit about the Brazilian contextualization for these trends, and then we'll have reasonable time for Q&A, questions and answers. And then again, this reminds me of saying, once you have a question, please do not use the chat where I'm going to be. You can still use the chat for general notes, just like this one. We have someone from Nigeria. Thank you so much for attending. But if you have a specific question, then I kindly ask you to use the Q&A icon that is just beside the chat icon, where I can have a better control of the questions and make sure that we're going to answer them on the last part of the webinar. Okay, I think that's it. So please, Vicent, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Leonardo. Thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to share our story. I will open up the presentation. Here we go. And I hope everybody can see my screen right now. All right, so I'll kick off right away. So this webinar is all about the winners of the low-touch economy. So how actually companies can recover and grow in the new normal that is created after this pandemic. Yeah, very quickly, I think Leonardo already did an explanation, but about Board of Innovation. We're a strategy and business design firm partnering with world's largest organizations to navigate fundamental shifts. And we have offices in Sao Paulo, New York, Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Singapore. All right, now that we got that covered, I'll jump into the content right away. What I have in front of me and what I hope to present to you in the coming 20 minutes or so is, first of all, the low-touch economy concept itself. Then quickly, the winners of the low-touch economy, some examples of organizations that are actually acting quite fast to pivoting to these changes. Then opportunities or white spaces, how you can act as an organization to respond in this low-touch economy. And then finally, Leonardo will dive deeper on that Brazilian context. And finally, we'll have time for Q&A. Important to mention maybe is that this whole presentation will be shared, so I'm happy to share the presentation with you, as well as a Portuguese version of our latest report on the low-touch economy, or even the English version if you're interested in that. So both versions, I'm happy to share those. So what is the low-touch economy all about? So the low-touch economy is basically the concept that we've created, that we've identified as driven by the idea of low-touch interactions and restrictions put in place during the COVID-19 crisis. So the global worldwide lockdown is actually forcing consumers and companies to not only first restrict their behavior, but afterwards as well to, in the long run, adapt their habits and adopt how they operate. And we've created a series of reports and materials that has been shared and read more than 100,000 times and has been published in quite a few renamed reports. And that's why Leonardo also invited us to share a story here. So as I said, we're a very open source organization, so you can actually access all these reports and all that material on lowtoucheconomy.com. So that explains, on one hand, the report that I'll highlight today is on that winners in the low-touch economy, on how you can actually recover or grow in this new normal. Then, and we have an introduction report on it. And then finally, there's dozens of other tools and materials that you can access over there. So first of all, that concept of that low-touch economy, how do we, why is this relevant today, and why did we come up with this concept early February, March? Well, we saw that, first of all, there's a lot of things happening like social distancing, hygiene precautions, travel restrictions, and limited large gatherings. So first shocks after COVID at the start of 2020. Afterwards, we see that actually a lot of our countries are actually changing their regulations, changing these restrictions. But now again, you see that several peaks are happening in different regions. Different countries are setting up different restrictions, rising and decreasing and increasing these restrictions. And that creates a lot of aftershocks, not only due to the, for example, limited travel, etc., but as well in the areas of business, unemployment, potential bankruptcies, changing political behavior or preferences, or acceleration of things like nationalism, etc. So these aftershocks is something that will be happening for quite a long time. And that's something that we even see in reports from Fortune that did research across CEOs globally to get their perspective on when do they believe organizations will fully recover at pre-pandemic levels. And the biggest portion of these interviewed CEOs actually say that it's most likely to them to be only by Q1 2022, which is still a long time, as we all know. So that being said, it is also a space for opportunities. What's important to know is that how does this what triggers this low-touch economy? First of all, as I said, there's quite a lot of health measures, like the elements that organizations or governments use to fight current and future crises. because what they see is that there's a lot of economical disruption, that on a micro and a macro level, there's a lot of challenges to really make sure that that the economy is continuing at its best, but that the balance between health measures and economical disruption actually forces people to change their behavior, to stay home, to keep a distance, to not come at the office, etc., which in the end creates long-term behavioral shifts. And that then again forces a lot of organizations to further invest in technological advancements. And that is quite an important loop that we see continuously happening, is that continuously these different triggers are happening. And that actually results in a lot of shifts. These shifts happen on the political side, the macroeconomic side, regulatory side, technology, industries, and human behavior. And with most of the reports that we produce, we actually focus on that human behavior, because we really believe that this is a part that is quite important, and that also will have a quite long-lasting impact. To give you an example, this is a very general example of the change in adoption of certain new technologies. So this is an overview that explains how fast certain new technologies were introduced and adopted by consumers. And you can see that these curves are accelerating. So this is over a very long period of time. We all know that the adoption of, for example, the internet was much faster than, let's say, a flushing toilet. But what's more important to say is that actually in a crisis like this, habits are changing much faster. So these adoption curves are accelerated drastically. To give you an example, if we look at eat therapy, we see that actually 36% of Americans that say that the crisis has quite a big impact on their mental health, and this actually resulted in the increased demand on one hand for these e-therapies, but on the other hand as well, an increased acceleration of technology investment in these areas. And then again, on the regulatory side, the openings of regulatory environment, for example, the FDA making new regulations and accelerating the frameworks for e-therapy last month. And this is something we see on a global level. So, for example, the Spanish government exploring new ways to roll out basic incomes, or Fauci, the advisor of President Donald Trump, says that in a perfect world, like, Americans would stop shaking hands. And I think we all are in a quite long-term lockdown situation already, and we all know that we do limit these actions, and that will result in quite long-term changes. That being said, again, there's changes in each of these areas, and shifts are happening on many fronts, and it's interesting to monitor these. Let's dive into the next topic, and again, feel free to share your questions in the meantime. Happy to answer them at the end of the webinar. Let's dive into some winners in the low-touch economy, and actually identifying what are ways to grow in a setup like this. So if you look at a few of the organizations that are actually growing in the low-touch economy, we can actually learn a lot from it. And we mainly want to use that as a way to learn how you can actually adapt your business as well. First of all, what's important to know is that you can actually look at some sort of a checklist on defining who is more prepared for a low-touch economy. There's several elements that you have, like offerings, audience, engagement, etc. These are all components of your business. And it's important to understand, first of all, what value do you provide, how do you deliver that value, and how do you capture that value? The three core components of a business model, let's say. What we do then is actually looking at these different elements and understanding whether these are impacted or changed in a low-touch economy. For example, Peloton, I don't know if many of you have it at home or have used it or know the product. They're an exercise equipment and media company, so they provide electronic in-home training equipment. So at-home fitness and spin classes. Their audience is mainly luxurious consumers, so it's quite an expensive product, but obviously these days quite highly interesting for many, since fitness centers are actually the first that are closed down. My wife was as well a part of the YMCA in New York City, and unfortunately we had to change to our gym at home afterwards. And what we can see actually is that they changed quite well towards the low-touch economy. First of all, they changed their value proposition, their audience, from luxurious customers to the mass. So they actually produced cheaper bikes that are accessible to more individuals, basically because they predicted that demand would increase. They would be able to produce cheaper products and make different models that are accessible to many. And second, they've also worked quite a lot on their supply chain side. For example, the introduction of Apple TV, with thousands of workouts on the Apple TV, as opposed to the screen that you would have on the bikes itself. On the other hand, the second example that I wanted to share, Beyond Meat, and quite a big challenger in the food and retail industry. They make plant-based meat substitutes, one of the most highly valued food startups in the world. They actually target health conscious and sustainable or vegan customers at first, and then suddenly they actually, due to the crisis, changed towards different models, where they actually changed their engagement from purely restaurants and fast food dining to actually increasing their presence in different dining and restaurant experiences. On the other hand, in their internal workspace, they changed quite a lot as well, because of the fact that they're working in labs as opposed to farms, and they are able to actually change quite a lot of their behaviors quite rapidly and be more in line with the restrictions and requirements for hygiene, etc. And then finally, they also changed their pricing model towards being more aggressive towards, originally they were more expensive, and now they actually position themselves as equal or cheaper than traditional meat. And that's something that I would recommend. We have quite a lot of tools on our website that can help you to understand your position and your way of potentially changing. But what's important to know is that you can actually look at a scorecard like this and identify where are you today and where would you like to go afterwards. That being said, I'll dive into the final part. It's a quick part of this webinar that actually focuses on helping you to identify opportunities and white spaces to venture in. And this is really something that we truly value as Board of Innovation, is helping organizations to do it yourself and to become better and improve the growth of your organization, even in a situation like this. First of all, it's important to know that it doesn't necessarily need to be a turnaround of the entire organization. There's typically different ways of changing what you do or improving what you do. You can innovate in the core of your organization. You can, on the other hand, explore adjacent opportunities, and then finally jump to wide spaces or completely new areas in that low-touch economy. And depending on your situation, on how much you are being disrupted or restricted, you can identify the field in which you want to play. For example, improved logistics processes are an important way to innovate at your core and actually to become more effective, efficient, and in line with your with the demand. Whereas if you would completely tap into new markets with completely new products, you're obviously very much going out of the comfort zone and the core of your business. We always say that it's important not to reinvent the wheel, but actually to look at what's happening in other industries or what other organizations are doing. So I would highly recommend you to as well dive into those, several of the resources that we have on the lowtoucheconomy.com, where you can find examples of more than 50 businesses, big and small, meaning large Fortune 500 companies, but as well startups that made pivots from old business models to new ones. To give you a bigger case example, PepsiCo, as you might have seen, is one of the rarely first corporates that actually did a pivot or an adoption of their process quite fast. So in less than 30 days, they developed 2 direct-to-consumer platforms so that they could access their customers directly. Obviously, launching the website is easy and doesn't even take 30 days. But if you're such a large organization, it is really important to understand the challenges of your supply chain, internal politics, the value chain that you've built up for years and years to overcome these. And that's why it's quite interesting to see how and what they did, just like many others. And finally, again, for you to identify those white space opportunities, you can use frameworks like this that can help you to come up with novel opportunities based on 6 main triggers. On one hand, industry shifts, then the regulatory side, changes in regulations, consumer behavior, societal changes, new resources or new technologies. And each of those has a different impact on the low-touch economy. So typically what we suggest is that actually industry shifts, new regulations and consumer behavior are at these stages the most impactful in terms of the change in or creation of opportunities. Because of the fact that technology itself is not accelerated. Technology, for example, was already there. It's just a matter of the fact that there's more interest or more investment these days, which still makes it a longer term to get that result. Finally, there's lots of examples here. I won't dive in depth here because again, you can find all those resources online, but it's important to know that there's a broad library of, on one hand, mappings of these opportunities that you could use as inspiration for yourself to do this exercise. Finally, and this will be my almost last slide, is what happens next. What's important for you to know is a question that we often get is how do we respond? How do we organize ourselves? And as an answer to that question, what we typically do is first of all set up a team. You probably will have an internal COVID response team already that is there to respond to the very operational and specific changes that need to happen. But then next to that, setting up or asking that team or different stakeholders in the company to actually monitor the new normal. So track changes and define the roles and responsibilities in the organization on how and who to respond to these changes. Then on the longer run with the more senior team to actually conduct ongoing self-assessments on your business category and your customers. So really doing that assessment internally on what is the impact to us, to then develop after that assessment a strategy on how to move forward. And again, it's an iterative process because we all know that the future is hard to predict, and especially these days. So therefore, we suggest doing this on an iterative level as well, in a more sprint fashion, as we would call it. And then finally, ideating opportunities. Once you have a strategy, you can actually set up multiple teams to develop new solutions, experiments, and validate and launch these things to see if they actually result in an impact or an uptake of your business. So that's what I would like to end with is hopefully you are ready to act on new white space opportunities. Again, feel free to tap into some of the cases or other reports that we have online, or to connect with me on LinkedIn or any other channels if you have any questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Vincent. I see we already have, can you just unshare your presentation for us? Vincent, I see we already have a couple of questions. I will somehow address them on mine, but I will still get back to them once we.
Perfect. Happy to.
So I will get back to these questions afterwards. I will try again, just as Vincent, not to take much time, just to bring a bit of my own reflections on how we can see this low-touch economy hitting Brazil and the extent that this will affect business and society here. I will bring a bit more data on what's happening in Brazil, and then raise a few questions and ideas, a final framework for us to discuss. So you can keep bringing your questions, and please, if you want to ask questions in Portuguese on the Q&A session, also feel free to do it. If you prefer, I will be translating for Vincent. So you're welcome to post questions on either Portuguese or English. Okay. Well, so as I said, I've been working on that for the last 4 months or so since I came across the report, and obviously at first glance we have an immediate impact of reduction on demand for most companies and most sectors, but we do have something that came across the report, which I resonate with, is heterogeneity. There is a lot of heterogeneity, right? So this is just one example of the low-touch economy report, where you can see that this was early China results. You had a few sectors with an upward in demand trend, whereas most sectors were experiencing a reduction, a strong reduction in demand, because different sectors have been put different challenges, right? So there is a lot of heterogeneity, and this is quite key on my speech here, to digest a bit of this heterogeneity and how this will impact Brazilian businesses, right? And now this, sorry if this is in Portuguese, but it's just to get a general trend from IBGE. You can see that while the first sectors like customer care, supermarkets, food were experiencing uptrends in demand in the first months. Obviously, when it comes to sectors such as fashion, books, and electronics, then you had electronics were like in between, and then the worst case scenarios for books, fashion, apparel industries. So again, a lot of heterogeneity across the sectors, not only worldwide, as the report has shown, but also looking at Brazil data, right? And we also have environmental side effects that I'll come back to it later on my talk, where we saw in China and Italy as exemplars, a strong reduction in pollution from the lack of activity and movement and transport, which also puts a bit of reflections on board on how low-touch economy would or would not affect sustainability on the long term as well. So this is a question that I already leave it to Vincent to get their perspective on it once we finish. And then the question is, what comes next? What happens? Do we recover? How fast do we recover? And how many different sectors will recover in the short, medium, long term, as the report and as Vincent's presentation has already discussed, right? And I take a particular sector where we see a very steady leap ahead, right? 10 years in 3 months. This is the e-commerce. This is obviously the most immediate impact that we see worldwide. 3 months, a growth that is equivalent to 10 years before that. And this is no different when we move for the Brazilian market. So you can see here, one platform, Mercado Livre, 1.7 million new buyers in the first month, right? And also the e-commerce chamber of data showing in April and May, respectively, a 98% increase and 137 increase in sales. So this is an immediate and a specific result that's important for us to understand. This has implications to inventory management, supply chains, negotiations across when you compare traditional bricks and mortar stores with e-commerce platforms that were already more prepared to handle this shift. And again, last mile issues with urban logistics. So we have multiple issues that we can come back later on the discussion to discuss as impacts of this e-commerce upward trend. Moving forward, I bring here signals that we had from Magazine Luiza, which is also a large platform, just as Mercado Libre in the country, where we were already experiencing a shift in consumer trends regarding the time available for personal care, for watching TV, for cooking, for home care, reducing, and a third of Brazilians saying that they prefer more time than more money. So this gives us a hint of how e-commerce can come as a major trend in the long run, right? Even after we have everything solved in terms of the pandemic itself. Most of these upward trend will not revert back to normality. I would offer this insight for discussion. And then on top of that, we have technology shifts that will certainly impact the reality of businesses, but that they, at the first glance, they seem like very far away from our reality, like those that the Low Touch Economy report offers us for reflection. So this is the question. When we go back to normal activities, to what extent we will see real concrete layout changes in restaurants, new configurations, the new use of the space, gadgets that we'll be using to protect ourselves while interacting, and how will these gadgets be available, how long it will take for them to be available at affordable prices. And then I start talking a bit about Brazil, right? Another issue here. So when we see something like that in Europe or in the US, there is a pace of how fast this new technology can become available. When we think about the Brazilian reality and the social structure and the income diversity that we have across the classes, the social classes, we will see a large share of the society that will probably take a long time before having any sort of access to this. Therefore, I move to a second discussion, which is how will be the recovery of your specific business, right? And as you've seen in the report, you can discuss, we have been discussing the V-shaped recovery, which is quite fast and assumes that 6 months time would be enough to bring everything back to reality. Now it's almost impossible to assume that trend, although the stock markets, both in US and Brazil, seems to offer the perspective of a V recovery. I wonder if this is a reality for real businesses, right? As the stock market is a reflection of a tiny share of the actual number of business, not in terms of sales, but in terms of number of different businesses, right? Then you have the U perspective, which is like not so fast recovery, but it's still recovering. Within that, we have seen this Nike logo style or tick check style, where you have a fast downturn, then you have a not as fast upturn, but it's still up, and on an optimistic note that it will get later down the line even better than we were before. And then we start moving a bit more towards the pessimistic alternatives, where you have an L shape, where we probably have a much lower return. It's not that it will be an L forever, but it's like such a long U that you can't see the finish of the view on a first glance, right? And that will take us a longer time. And then my question is that a matter of defining if the recovery on general will be V, U, and L, or to understand for each type of business, as the report interestingly teases out, different businesses may have totally different shapes on their recovery based on what they had as skills and capabilities, prior to the crisis based on what they are doing during the crisis and how they will manage the long-term perspective. And that's where I bring my contribution here for the K shape that some people start talking about, which is the idea that while some companies will benefit largely from that, some companies will experience a huge change on a downward curve on the long term as well, and will probably have to rethink their businesses entirely, right? Now I'll talk a bit about this K logic. So this is a first glance on US data as well, which already shows top quartile, which means top performing companies or top quintile moving upwards, while bottom companies moving down. So you can already see the shape of the K being formed, right? This can be a gap year, meaning that on the long run, everyone will be together again on an upward trend, but this can actually mean the end of some businesses and the creation of new others, because you might not survive for the year of a gap year, might be something that you cannot manage at all, and you cannot survive through that gap to be there afterwards, right? So that's when I start breaking this down to the Brazilian reality. So I bring an insight here for us all to discuss that this shape will be seen at the global level, where we will see different countries recovering on a very different pace from other countries, depending on how they react to the crisis and how they prepare recovery. We will see that Brazil against other countries, and I wouldn't see a very good perspective for Brazil at the moment. But we also see Brazil as a huge country. It's equivalent to Europe and the US, depending how you take the perspectives, the dimensions you consider. So we will see heterogeneity inside Brazil as well. So it's very hard to say what will happen to Brazil. We will see regions of Brazil recovering very fast, while others recovering in a very different pace. And within that, if you take supply chains, we will see different parts of the supply chain being challenged in different ways, and different industry sectors being challenged in different ways as well. So although we have all this positive energy that stems from the e-commerce results, we will see huge shifts when you consider hoteling, tourism, aviation, fashion. We will be talking about a much tougher gaps to recover from. And then I could not avoid bringing a bit of the supply chain discussion to the conversation, obviously, from my background. So we do have a few implications that the report offers to us, and I take particularly I highlight three aspects for us to consider in our discussion as well. The first one is digitalization. So the extent that those companies that were more prepared will be the winner takes all perspective, or whether other businesses will manage. We can see now examples in Brazil of small businesses coming together to offer alternative platforms. This is another possible question: to what extent small business will be able to set up together as cooperatives alternative platforms that can offer a different way for accessing the consumer, possibly with a better margin, but on the other hand, with much smaller market shares in the first moment. And how much investment would these alternative platforms need to fight the big guys, for example? The second trend is on the local versus global debate. So when we think about that globally, one thing is for Europe and the US to revert from China back to local sourcing. But when you think about Brazil, we have issues here in terms of the lack of industrialization, or the reduction in the industrialization the country has gone through in the last 25 years or so. So how much can we recover, and how fast can we recover the industrialization to be able to provide local alternatives, supply alternatives from things that we currently import from China? This is a key issue for me. And then the third one is the sustainability. Obviously, how much we'll be able to reflect and rethink our physical footprint, reduce bricks and mortars to increase e-commerce and other channels, and how much this will affect the materiality of the business and the social and environmental outcomes that stems from this movement, where it can be, sorry, for example, reducing the environment effect, while at the same time increasing social issues such as unemployment. So I bring what I'm calling a sandwich framework, building on top of the lower touch economy framework, where from one hand you have regulation, where and I sympathize with Vincent's reflection that regulation is not as top priority as consumer behavior. But when it comes to Brazil, we do have a few particularities. We have a federation as well, just like the US, to some extent. And we've seen that while the country level regulation has been very shy on social restrictions, lockdowns, the government, the state level, we have 27 states, the state level, especially in Rio and São Paulo, have been a bit tougher on lockdowns. So this variation again across the states makes the reflection on the consequences of the low touch very complicated, as businesses that are spread across the country will face different regulations, and you have to take on board these different regulations when adapting their supply chain. And we still have the bottom-up behavioral change that you mentioned. And then I touch on one of the questions that I already saw in the Q&A section, where if you think about behavior, one thing is the upper class behavior shift of staying home, shifting to home office, and all the consequences of this, adapting to technology and gadgets that allow for a low touch behavior. But when we move downward to the lower social classes, with no access even sometimes to clean water in a large share of the country, how will you assume that you're going to increase washing hands and all the sanitation measures and precautions? Never mind the social distancing that conflicts with our collective behavior of hugs, kisses, and warm approach when engaging in social events, and even professionally, being a nation and a culture that is more prone to physical contact than most European and North counterparts. So this is a reflection. And again, the third element that is quite strong on the low touch logic is technology as not the key element, but an enabler, as you've mentioned, that is already there and that may be used to allow for low touch solutions. But again, we will face restrictions in the country for technology adoption in multiple levels. So I will leave it there. I've used most of my time. I think we can have a very healthy discussion. I have here my contacts again on social media, email, and our blog for us to keep the discussion. Particularly, I've glanced across the attendees, and there are many names that I don't know yet. So feel free to connect and engage. And here I stop, and I'll take a look at the Q&A. While I look at the Q&A, Vincent, if you want to make any comments on my presentation, while I start looking at the Q&A and bouncing questions back at you and me.
Sure. So one of the things that I saw is that you've presented that uptake in on the e-commerce side, and that's something there's some publications also by Reuters that also support that this is happening as well within Brazil. So the uptake has been about 30% over the past 5 weeks, and it's quite clear to say that obviously there's few global changes, but this one is definitely one that you can see as a big driver. But happy to answer any additional questions.
So we've talked a bit about the collective nature of Brazil. If there are more questions on that, I will be happy to take. We also brought a bit of the Brazilian market specifically on the question from Cecilia. So if you have a more particular question on the sector or anything in mind, please bring forward. We have a question here on corporate transparency. What are the impacts on transparency? Do you see that companies, I'll give this to Vincent while I read the other ones. Do you think that together with everything that we see, do you see a stronger pressure for companies to improve their transparency and the communication of social and environmental impacts in particular? There is a discussion whether sustainability goes backwards when there is a crisis, whether it goes forward, because now this is a bit of a different crisis. I would like your views on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's quite some different behavior. First of all, there's different types of organizations, and second, in terms of timelines, short and long term. In terms of the short term, I think there was definitely a decrease in transparency and also towards sustainability. I think the hygiene precautions, the plastic shielding, the disposable products, the fact that suddenly cups are instead of reusing, completely individually used. So there's quite a lot of behavior in the short run against sustainable, long-term sustainable and transparent behavior. What on the other hand is our belief is that actually the change in customer behavior is actually happening. That quite a lot of, and you can mainly see that across certain European and certain European areas, not necessarily in the US, for example, that there's actually quite a big drive towards sustainability in the long run, as well as corporate transparency. To one of the first questions that was asked as well, is that because of the fact that employees and customers are really interacting directly with brands on the customer front, and that employees are working at home, that this definitely requires more transparent communication, openly, publicly, online, because of the fact that you don't have your employees in your office every single day. So communication needs to be formalized and increased. And on the sustainability front as well, people want to connect with brands that actually move the needle, as opposed to just do it for PR's sake. And then maybe to end on the sustainability side, what you can definitely see is that there was a positive impact on, for example, pollution, air pollution, in the short run. So that was a positive effect in the short run. But we all know that, and we see that in the for example, the openings of certain Asian countries, that actually the air pollution levels are right away at where they were prior to the lockdown. So that actually that behavior didn't change yet. So the fact that everybody was still relying on their traditional ways of working, hopefully we can see a decrease in traffic, but at this stage there's no signs for that yet.
Just a quick note before I move to the next question. I would agree completely. I think that one thing is the pressure for transparency, particularly if you think about reducing touch, reducing connections, reducing interactions. You will have to substitute that with alternative ways of producing transparency to communicate with your customer, just as you said. But when it comes to sustainability, I also wouldn't see a clear trend, and probably just back to normality as soon as people can be able to move across. Now, what I would say is that I'm still to find them, and if anyone has a study such as this one that I will mention, I would be happy to look at it, comparing the reduction on traffic and transportation against the increase in packaging. My first take would be that it's better to reduce transportation because we reduce energy consumption that we cannot revert back, whereas packaging can always move forward to disposable and biodegradable packaging alternatives that would somehow fix this problem. But I haven't seen a precise comparison between these two. I leave it here. We have an interesting question from Andre Laura. I've been looking at this element. He brings back the idea of the 6 triggers that you've mentioned, Vincent, and asks whether there is some discussion on the correlations between them. In my case, I've been working with how behavior and technology together, behavior and regulation and technology. That's exactly the way I'm going. I wonder how you how you see that?
No, I totally believe that there's a strong interaction, and if there is interaction between those different drivers, there's even an acceleration in change happening, and there's a lot of interaction. So especially technology is influencing a lot of the other components, but as well, if for example, it is really a ripple effect. So once certain restrictions by regulations happens, there are social impacts, there is a social impact, and in the long run, it might really change the behavior of customers or consumers. Obviously, the core principles and core culture, like the question from Alice on the idea of handshaking, that it's something that might be easy to change in one country, but probably impossible to change in another, for example, in Brazil. And that makes total sense. I think the traditions and core cultural values will stay, but there are some certain tweaks that will start to happen. The fact from working from home to avoid traffic jams and to actually potentially be more effective is something that you could see across quite a lot of regions. So that's one thing that I can say is definitely there are interconnections between all of them, and they actually result in ripple effects. And we actually, because of a question like that we got in one of our previous sessions, is actually we've created a map of ripple effects. So again, if you go to lowtoucheconomy.com, you can actually find these maps. There's even interactive ones that you can click on and use or update yourself on how these different things are interacting with each other.
Thank you. Very interesting. I'll bring together two questions here. The first one is whether we will, from Rodrigo, that we will experience this movement, this shift towards the winner takes all, is an expression we often see, where big platforms will take most of the market, and this will restrain entrepreneurial activity. And then I will bring the specificities of the education sector from Humberto's question, in particular for the education sector. I will give my take on it, and then I will pass it over to you. I would say that these entrepreneurial opportunities do not change because it depends on the sector. While some sectors may have large players that are gathering most of the share, we do have a lot of change. So again, on my preliminary pilot surveys with the cohorts I'm teaching at the MBA at COPPEAD, for example, we saw people responding to things such as that they will take more than 6 months before they go into a restaurant again, 3 to 6 months, that will take more than a year for them to think about air traveling again, and that will take them more than 1 up to 2 years to think about a large wedding, or even such a large wedding or a concert. So when people have that in mind, and a large share of people responding, the majority of students responding something like that, I think that this is also an opportunity for a huge reshape of the market, and some businesses won't adapt, and some will be able to create solutions that can actually manage this fear, this step back, while at the same way producing some equivalent experience. And then I will pass it over to you both, and the things I've mentioned and the educational sector specifically also, if you can.
Yeah, for sure. I think on the first front, on the incentives, so on Rodrigo's question on the incentives for entrepreneurial behavior, I think there's, if you look at the corporate world, there's, and actually in the education sector, it's fairly similar, is that it has many components. Entrepreneurship on an organizational level, it's about making decentralized decisions and allowing everybody to take decisions. And I think that's in the short term is actually quite restricted. I think there's more centralized decision making, more strategic thinking of, we need to solve this, we need to cut costs, we need to recover out of this scenario in a smart way. So there's a lot of process optimizations and centralization. But on the other hand, you see quite a big drive towards experimentation, iterative decision-making based on actual customer data. Because what you can see is that the old way of doing things, traditional research, over several months to then make a decision for the coming years is completely outdated. It was already quite challenging, but and potentially irrelevant. But these days, it's actually even more irrelevant because we don't know what it will look like in the coming months. We have to use data from today, and we have to actually present what we have in mind and get that feedback. So first of all, that iterative behavior is highly incentivized because of the fact that the future is proven to be unpredictable. And secondly, the experimentation side of things, of allowing people to try it out, to prove, to get small revenues, because of the value of small revenues also being increasingly relevant, that these things are actually increased. But on the other hand, centralized decision making is still something that is prevailing these days. But I'm assuming that actually later in 2021 that this might change as well.
Okay. I will assume that Flavio's question was answered. We kind of touched upon transparency and ESG and sustainability already. But I have an interesting question from Erica. I'll give my take, and then I want to hear from you as well. She's provoking the idea that there is this side of social distancing as something that changes our behavior on a more permanent basis. And on the other hand, we have this intense will to socialize again whenever possible. Like if we were caught in a cage, and once you release us from the cage, we will be eager to socialize. I would give a comment based on something that I look at, which is the fashion business, and I'll mention Zara. So we've seen a few Zara stores on the first day of reopening in Asian countries with a long queue. But these seem more like a short-term, immediate effect of I want to prove that I can be out again than a long-term trend. While we saw these queues on Zara store, we saw Zara's report saying that they are cutting down, I think, 1,000 stores, if I'm not wrong, worldwide, or 2,000, reducing their footprint, moving strong to digitalization. So they mentioned reducing the footprint, increase e-commerce and omni-channel and digitalization, and third main dimension, address sustainability. So you see that they seem to understand that peak, immediate peak right after we are free to go, let's say, it's a momentaneous getaway, you know. And what's your view on that?
No, I totally agree. I think the fact that there's a long-term change towards this certain behavior is changing. Although there is a peak afterwards when certain restrictions are lifted, people tend to come together again and value socialization even more. But in the long run, there's a lot of people that are suddenly exposed to new ways of working, new ways of purchasing products, new ways of socializing with each other. And that percentage is going to have an impact on the overall behavior, which is how typically these large organizations make their decisions. All right.
Yeah, I totally agree, Vincent. I don't know how, but we've managed to cover all the questions in time because I know you have another meeting. So we will close here. Again, thank you very much for all the attendees to be joining and engaging with interesting questions. I hope you've liked the reflection, the discussions, the insights. Feel free to follow both Vincent, the Board of Innovation, and myself to keep on the discussion and to interact. Thank you, Vincent, for your time and for your insights and your clarity on looking at what is going on with the world. And thank you for sharing this with us and engaging with Brazil.
All right. Thanks so much and have a good day.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. For those that are still here, we will have these available on the YouTube afterwards. So feel free to tell others that could not make it to watch the whole webinar afterwards whenever they want. And with this, we close the dialogue, International Dialogue event webinar by COPPEAD. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.